Hello YouTube. For today's video, what do you say we change things up a little bit? Oh yeah, much better. This is an ASMR channel now. World of possibilities. Gross. Okay, just kidding. This is a serious video, I promise. Today I'm here to talk about someone who means something to me. Or at least I think he does. Or at least the symbols that make him up and survive him mean something to me. Bear with me. Hello again, YouTube. My name is Markion. I've been working in mental health for almost 10 years, and here I like to explore ideas around self-actualization and positive psychology. So, gather round, children, because I've got a story for you today. And as I tell it, I'd like for you to keep in mind the stories that your family keeps close. See if you can give them some thought. So, my grandfather, Mihailo Ozaruk, grew up in a small village in western Ukraine. And this was around early 1920s. Really he probably couldn't have picked a worse time. Starting 1932, he experienced firsthand the effects of the famine genocide engineered by the Soviet Union. Ooh, I just realized this video has spicy words in it. If this was a proper big boy channel, I'd have to worry about demonetization. Like and subscribe. Right, so famine genocide. In Ukrainian we call it the Holodomor, which translates closest to terror famine. There's some academic debate as to how much of the famine was directly attributable to genocidal intent and how much was good old-fashioned Soviet incompetence, but by all accounts it was a bad time to be alive. You hear stories about cannibalism, about needing to steal to get on to the next day, parents starving themselves that their children might have a chance, nasty stuff. The laws at the time supported the Soviet policy of collective farming, where anything you grew was taken and to be redistributed to you. They were real good at the first part and not so much at the second. And as a result, millions died. Again, academics are arguing about it, but estimates range from about 3 to 12 million, depending on who you ask. Yeah, not pretty. Despite that, Grandpa made it through, some way or another. It must have taken a lot to just scrounge enough food to live to the next day at that time period. A lot of grit, a lot of willpower, I imagine. But he did it some way or another, and he did it again and again until the famine period was over by the late 30s. Do or die, you know? And so what was his prize for cheating death? Let's hear it from my history buffs in the back. World War II. After having been made to suffer deprivation in this way, it makes sense that he'd had enough of outsider politics causing suffering in his homeland. He wanted to stand up and fight for something. So he signed up with the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or UPA. This being World War II, fighting Soviets meant strange bedfellows. And let's hear it again from the history buffs in the back. The UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, was uncomfortably cozy with the Nazi Party for a time. But the alliance didn't last, and as a result, UPA had to contend with fighting both the Soviets and the Nazis. Towards the early 40s, they started making it a point to go after Nazi outposts and encampments. Troops, guerrilla-style warfare was their bread and butter. Now I can be sure Grandpa took this to heart because one day, guns blazing, he and his troop attacked what was supposed to be a pretty isolated outpost. Intel must have been piss poor that day, though, because at what was supposed to be a pretty isolated encampment, they found themselves swarmed in the woods, hugely outnumbered. So they did the smart thing, live to fight another day. They laid down their arms and were captured. What they didn't expect was getting put on a train to one of the death camps. Yeah, this is one of the details that I got fuzzy. I want to say he was sent to Auschwitz, but that might just be the availability heuristic at work. It could have been Dachau, it could have been one of the others on the Eastern Front. The reason why it matters is because the camp he was sent to happened to have a guard that Mikhailo recognized. And the guard recognized him back. See, they knew each other, came from neighboring villages, from before the wartime. Anyway, the guard, recognizing Mikhailo, saw to it that his men took out beyond the camp limits and dumped Mikhailo there. In doing so, if a bit unceremoniously, freeing him. Having come uncomfortably close to a brush with death more than once at this point, Mikhailo picked himself up, dusted himself off, and likely thanked his lucky stars for his good fortune here. Anyway, he walked to a nearby village and nursed himself back to health shortly thereafter. I don't know exactly how the next few years went for him, but he must have found some semblance of the peace he was looking for at this point. Around this time, he met my grandmother, real classy lady. She studied languages at university and spoke 6 or 7 of them, if I recall correctly. She too had suffered under the Holodomor and the wartime stresses, and with the war ending, things were finally looking up. So, to avoid the once again tightening grip of the USSR, they quickly got on a ship to America and made their way down to the United States, where they had my father, an only child, during the baby boom, post-war years. And the story stays pretty happy at this point. From what I know, he built furniture the rest of his life. My grandmother worked for Kodak Company. They were big back then. Changed his name legally to Michael to better fit in with the English-speaking world of America. I've been told he made awesome pickled vegetables and made moonshine. That can't be right because they definitely didn't have a distillation setup. It might have been a vodka infusion with like garlic and herbs and other things. I don't know what else it could have been. He was pretty unflappable, unperturbed by most things. I imagine that a lived experience like his would make you pretty good at knowing what's worth and not worth blowing your top about. Those sorts of things shape you into something you weren't before. And then, early 90s, I came along. I hear they were ecstatic to be grandparents, as I imagine most are. And that's where his story ends, about a year after my birth. Grandma passed shortly after my sister was born, about a year subsequent to that. But here's the thing that drives me crazy about this story. I can't believe it. I don't know if it actually happened or not. I barely even remember my grandfather on my dad's side, if I'm being honest. He was alive for the first year of my life. At least with the one on my mother's side, I can recall some time spent together, things we did. In the case of Mikhailo Ozaruk, however, I have those sort of flash pan memories that feel like some combination of stories told to you, pictures you've seen, and the barest notion of sense memory. Surviving famine, fighting in a war, getting sent to and released from one of the only death factories in history is a lot. But it's not just that I don't remember him all that well. I don't know how reliable the story is. Now, with the story I just told you, I tried to remember it best I could. But there's always gaps, right? Tweak this, fill in that, little embellishments, details for flavor, filling in places where either all I have is this idea of, well, this happened and this happened, this must have happened after this because this, or, well, the Wikipedia article says that this time in history had this, so that must have gone there. What's more, I don't remember the story as my father told it to me. The last time it was probably a couple Christmases ago. Not long. Okay, let's talk about my dad's telling of the story. When he tells the story, he's accessing decades worth of memories and information about the originator of these stories. They call it the primary source. My dad heard him tell them plenty of times, I'm sure. And my dad certainly tells it more richly than I do because of his experience hearing Grandpa tell it himself. But we need to qualify those decades of experience with the fact that memory fades. And at this point, the last possible time my dad could have heard the story is almost 3 decades ago. So, fine, let's go a step closer to the source. Grandpa himself. According to my father, the person who knew it best was, perhaps understandably, pretty tight-lipped about his life and the experience pre-war, interwar, and during. Some memories would have been too ugly to share with the son. Some would have been too painful to access personally, and some he would have plain forgot too. Now, to be clear, I'm not doubting the overall story beats. My dad, for example, tells me Grandpa had the forearm tattoo found on the inmates at the death camps. And there's plenty of furniture pieces, for example, we have still around that he himself made. And he was definitely in the right place at the right time. Wrong place for the other life events to have lined up the way they've been told. It's more the issue that what we're left with is a almost century-long at this point multi-generational game of telephone, which on the one hand sucks. I wish I could know with, doubtless certainty that the facts I have correspond exactly to events as they happened. But communication, by its nature, involves a loss in information. From you accessing your memory to finding the right words to put to it, to expressing those words without stumbling over them, to being accurately understood by the listening party, being heard as you intended. And then that whole process over again for each person passing it on. So if communication is busted, what does that do for stories? What does it mean for stories? What does it mean for this story? Another way of looking at it is, the yarn I spun you is a sort of tall tale. And tall tales or myths are symbolic in their truth rather than empirical. Okay, so what are you talking about, Markian? Okay, when we read children fairy tales and other bedtime stories, we're not trying to teach them to avoid bipedal wolves who speak English fluently and dress up in drag. Rather, we're telling them something about the abstract truth of the social world. In Red Riding Hood's case, some of the lessons might be don't take expedient shortcuts, don't trust carelessly, and trust your senses. And with personal myths, family myths, it's like that with even more room for variability. Because the story isn't shared culturally, like, say, Jack and the Beanstalk, nobody's going to stop you in the middle of your story and go, no, hang on. That's not what happens next. You're telling it all wrong. Actually, now that I mention it, I wonder what parts of my story my pops is going to tell me I got wrong. Okay, so much fewer people can stop you to correct the details in the cases of personal myth. But for all the rest of you know, my story could have not had an ounce of truth to it. The whole thing could have been made up. Does that make it any less valuable?
No. Obviously, no.
And to really drive this point home, I want to remind you, in case you forgot, that this is the internet, and that means you can't necessarily trust anything you see on its face. The image you clicked on in the thumbnail of this video is 100% not my grandfather. Gotcha. So who is he? He's the leader of an anarchist libertarian movement in the early 20s. Name of Nestor Machno. I'll put that on the screen. You can pause it and search him up if you like. Has a whole Wikipedia article and everything. I'll wait. You have to pardon the deception, but I wanted to keep some personal details of his off the internet, and at the same time make a point while doing so. But what does stand up to scrutiny, regardless of what was or was not true in my story, are the lessons you take from the stories you hear on the internet. Some you might have gotten from my little tale, factual truth be damned, are 1. People are incredibly resilient, way more than they know. 2. Some things are worth risking your life for. 3. There's no shame in saying you've had your fill of hardship. And 4. The beauty of peace is that it gives you the freedom to enjoy the world. There's no life or death call to action happening. And here's why I wanted you to keep your family myths in mind, because those are just the most general, most universal of some lessons that could be taken away from my grandpa's story. The personal connection we each have to tales about people we believe to be like us in some way ties us to those stories' messages much more closely. This happens to be especially the case for shared identity, shared experience, shared culture, and family stories on its own already touches on at least 2 of those. The third, depending on how you define it. So when I pickle vegetables to preserve them, or insist on finishing my plate, even if I'm a little full, I feel connected to the simple pragmatism of the idea that food is precious and shouldn't be wasted if it can be avoided. When I shape a bow out of a wooden stave, or I learn a new way to join 2 pieces of wood without screws or nails, I feel connected to the idea of someone who came before me, and I feel motivated by that idea of someone to improve what I am towards what I could be. And that can be a powerful thing if you let it. So I do hope that this little ramble has got you thinking about the myths you hold close. The stories that we do keep near and dear to us are worth thinking about because they pare down the infinity of possibilities in the future to a finite number of hopefully positive influences and ideas. So make sure you choose wisely which those are. Anyway, this has gone on long enough. Be good, be well, and be better. Bye.